The second lesson this morning is taken from Paul's letter to the congregation in Rome. I urge you then, my friends, remembering the mercies of God, to offer your very selves to Him as a living sacrifice, dedicated and acceptable. That is the kind of worship for you as sensible people. Do not model your behavior on the contemporary world, but let the renewing of your minds transform you so that you may discern for yourselves what is the will of God for you, what is good and acceptable and mature. It's a good question, isn't it? What is it that shapes the content of our minds on most days? What is it that forms our life, dictates our calendar? Here we are on a Sunday morning, full of interest and motivation, I trust, whether we're 17 or 70. What determines what kind of people we shall be as we leave this place? We must admit that there are realities that are determinative in our lives, that shape us, over which we have little or no control. There are the genes that our grandmothers gave us, the pollution we put up with driving the Edens, the parents we got stuck with long ago, the breaks we do get or do not get. There are many things about life over which we have no control, but there are other influences and forces that do press upon us day in and day out. Do this, drink that, which we can say something about, do something about, to which we can either passively surrender or actively counter. Some of these are benign, harmless, of course. Take fashion, for example. All of us tend to be, at least in these parts, conformists. Thank goodness we do, I guess. Too highly creative dress, whether in the workplace or at worship on Sunday morning, would probably be a distraction. So most of us take our orders. Commentator yesterday on television pointed out that for the first time in years, the governor's conference consisted of more than blue suits and power ties, because the new governor from Minnesota showed up. Someone, somewhere in the deep, mysterious dark of the fashion world, though, every year rather decrees the look of the season, and we all tend to respond, or at least our wives do. There aren't too many wild ties out there this morning, to my observation. Not even those strange costumes that walk past our homes on the way to school are really individual works of art. In New Trier High School or any of the other schools about, the only nonconformist really is the first one. Sophomore appeared at breakfast one morning with one red sock on and one green sock on, and her father said sarcastically, "Well, is that what they're wearing in school these days?" "No," said his daughter, "but they will be tomorrow." But there's danger here as well, perennial danger. Why do we conform? Why do we let the culture dictate how we shall think and how we shall live? What emblem rides over our heart? Why we drink what we drink? Isn't it finally because we do find it more comfortable to fit in? We want to be reasonably secure in our acceptance by others. We like a sense of belonging. Feeling peculiar outside, isolated, different, is troubling to most of us, not just the young people, and so we blend in. What's the danger? The danger is that the dictates of culture and crowd at certain levels may not always be for our health and good. For example, there are groups in high school and college who are more than happy to welcome and affirm, provided the newcomer plays by the rules of the game. For example, when it comes to the use and abuse of alcohol and drugs. Studies seem to indicate that a lot of young people abuse alcohol not because they care much about the alcohol, but because they care preeminently about belonging somewhere. And that's one of the badges of admission in a lot of groups. One mother capitalized on this need to be part of the group. Her 17-year-old son had started being just late enough each day that he would miss the school bus. And then she would presumably have to drive him and then rush to get to work on time herself. Well, one morning, instead of heading for school, with her son. This woman chased down the school bus, honking frantically until it pulled over. And then she pulled up in front of it where everybody could watch them, all eyes were upon them, and as her son got out, she jumped from the driver's seat, ran around the car, gave him a big motherly hug and kiss, and called loudly, "Goodbye, sweetheart, you be careful at school today." Her son never missed the bus again. So the first commandment in the youth culture, which pretty well governs these days, is don't make a fool out of yourself. Stories told of a young new music teacher who had to be hired in the middle of the year in the area here, and she decided to go ahead with the concert that had been planned in any event, but clearly the young musicians did not feel very well prepared and were overly anxious, obviously so. Then she made the big mistake just before the concert of saying to them, "Now, if at any point you're not sure of your part, just drop out and fake it." Well, when the big moment arrived, a sweep of her baton, she gave the downbeat, she was greeted with dead silence. It's not just the young people who don't want to stick out. There are adults, I suspect, on the North Shore whose attitudes and energies are largely dictated by cultural pressures. The right symbols, social circles, sets of attitudes are adopted almost unconsciously and without any real reflection. If you really lived up to some of the scripts that the culture pushes around here, you're going to have to neglect some rather basic realities, such as time with the family, time for your own spiritual needs. There's a price to pay. In other words, when you let the world around you shape too much you and your way of life. And further, the crowd and the culture are incredibly fickle taskmasters, as in the fable I told the young people. What they demand of you today, they may laugh at you about tomorrow. But even more important and critical, if as a person we are shaped too much from without by culture and custom and media and the latest public opinion, or even family and friends, we tend to end up rather empty and unreal inside. If you let others shape you, if you live as if you had antennae on your head, finding your way by responding always to the smiles and frowns, the applause and pressures of the crowd around, you end up in the end of little substance and even less strength. And I think Arthur Miller caught this American tendency in his rather well-known play, Death of a Salesman. It's been back on the boards lately. With its central character, Willy Loman. Perhaps you remember his life was dominated by an insatiable need for social acceptance, which he thought was a guarantee of financial success. He says to his boys at one point, "I thank Almighty God you're both built like Adonises. Because the man who can make an appearance in the business world, the man who creates personal interest, is the man who gets ahead. Be liked, and you'll never want. You take me, for instance. I never had to wait in line for a buyer. Willy Loman is here, that's all they had to know, and I went right through." At his funeral, his son Biff stands at the graveside and says, "Poor Dad, he never knew who he was." The only way to have wholeness, to have a core within us that is sound, that we're comfortable with, is to take responsibility for our life and decide who we shall be, no matter the winds that buffet. "See, I've set before you this day life and death, therefore choose life that you may live." I've always found those words interesting because they come right after the admonition that one obey the commandments and the statutes and the ordinances of God. It's interesting, however, that the old book never tries to coerce us or pressure us or force us. It always insists that there must be free and responsible decision, as if to say, only as you make up your own mind will your faith in life have any kind of integrity. Whether you agreed with her politics or not, Margaret Thatcher, England's Prime Minister, was certainly a woman who knew who she was. And she knew where I came from as well. She once said, when I was a little girl and I would ask Father, "Can I do something? My friends are doing it," he would say, "Never do something because your friends are doing it. You do it either because you want to do it and it's right for you to do it, and it does not make any difference what your friends are doing. You make up your own mind and you persuade other people to follow you. And her life story pretty well indicates that that's what she did all her days. It's the only way to be your own person, to know the integrity and consistency and self-respect that are real life. Arthur Gordon tells of a visit he felt privileged to make early in his career in journalism to the great Rudyard Kipling. He writes, "He was so small, the crown of the floppy hat he wore was not much higher than my shoulder, and I doubt if he weighed more than 120 pounds. His skin was dark for an Englishman's, his mustache was almost white, his eyebrows were thick and as tangled as marsh grass, but behind the gold-rimmed glasses, his eyes were still as bright as a terrier's. He was 69 years old. Looking back on my visit, I think he knew that in my innocence, as a young reporter, I was eager to love everything and please everybody, and he was trying in his own way to warn me not to lose my own identity in the process. Because time after time he came back to the same theme, which went something like this: the individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. To be your own person is hard business. If you try it, you'll be lonely often and sometimes frightened. But no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. Don't let the world around you squeeze you into its own mold. Adapt yourselves no longer to the pattern of this present world. Do not conform yourselves to the standards of this age. Do not model yourself on the behavior of the world around you. Why? Because you run the risk of losing your own soul, of never being real as a human being, because we're real only when in some sense our life is intentional, is decided. And equally important, we become real only as we decide for a ruling discipline. We mustn't confuse the decisive life with a life lived according to our momentary desires and impulses, just doing what we want to do. Frank Sinatra sang, "I did it my way." Well, all right, if my way is a way freely chosen of direction and discipline, of consistent and powerful vision, but not all right if doing it my way means doing what I feel like doing at the moment, following whatever impulse happens to hit me. That way is chaos and slavery as destructive as simply running after the crowd out there. You see, to have integrity means to be integrated around some steady commitment, command, some consistent vision of what life is all about. That's the intentional, the decisive life, a life which has decided for some great discipline. That's what it means to be a disciple, by the way. Same word, to place oneself at the disposal of a life discipline. I think this is one of the most profound paradoxes about life. Only as we day by day thoughtfully and deliberately use our heads and place ourselves at the disposal of a higher will do we really enjoy freedom from the pressures of culture and crowd and the seduction of impulse and desire. Do we truly become our own? See, life by the will of God is not surrender of our own mind and will, really. It is, in fact, liberation of both of them. Let the renewal of your own mind transform you, Paul writes, so that you may figure out for yourself what is the will of God for you, what is good and acceptable and mature. And for a Christian, this life discipline means preeminently Jesus. A Christian is quite simply someone who has decided to follow Jesus' way, the man of Nazareth. I don't use the name a lot around here, at least not as much as a lot of ministers do, because I'm afraid for many he's become a kind of cosmic figure that is empty of any real hard content. But this does not mean that he is ever far from my mind, because my understanding over the years of what God is like and what I am called to be, at least, has been shaped pretty decisively by him. Doesn't mean I'm anywhere near achieving what I would like to. So if I do not speak about him as much as some, I try to speak from him. because I'm convinced that when we commit ourselves to learning his way of seeing things in life and living as he lived, however inadequately, such a decision in life leads to the ultimate peace and satisfaction and freedom and joy. Let me give you two examples of persons whose lives were decisively formed, I think, by their allegiance to him. The first is Robert Speer, a great Christian layman of a generation ago, graduate of Princeton, man of the world, active and productive. But one time he set down what he considered to be the secret of his life. He wrote, "Jesus gives me a clear moral vision and the courage to try and live by that vision. He gives me the desire to work in the world as intensely as he worked. He kindles me when I grow sluggish or indifferent to a positive and aggressive antagonism to evil within and without. He gives me confidence in the truth and so helps me to rest, knowing that no matter what happens in the world, God and truth somehow will prevail. He gives me grace and strength to try at least things I know that are impossible, and to attempt first of all the things that are hardest to do. He helps me to keep on even when I know I can't. He saves me from the fret and destruction of pride and helps me to cease to care for the things that could make me sick. He helps me to keep central things clear in life and not be fogged or broken down by the accessories or secondary things. He gives me, in a word, a new and living principle. And I believe that there is a new spirit inside my own that would not be there if it had not been for him, and if it were not for him today." Now there's decision for a certain disciplining spirit in one's life. And if that sounds a little too bromidic, let me give you, in addition, perhaps my favorite picture of a man liberated from the crowd by his allegiance to his God. Perhaps you remember him, Eric Liddell, hero of the movie Chariots of Fire. It's still around in rental. It repays seeing again. But inspiring as the movie was, I suspect that many moderns who saw it could not really quite understand a personality so principled that he would be prepared to throw away fame and success rather than run on Sunday in the 1924 Olympic Games. That age does seem gone, doesn't it? But the film really does little justice to the man on the whole. And I suspect few moviegoers caught the significance of the words that were flashed on the screen, maybe didn't even stay for them, after the title credits. They read, "Eric Liddell, missionary, died in occupied China at the end of World War II. All Scotland mourned." You see, after the famed Olympic victory that was his, he walked away from it all to go to China as a missionary educator. He taught science at the Anglo-Chinese College in Tientsin. As conditions in China deteriorated in the weeks before Pearl Harbor, he arranged for his wife and children to be returned to England, planning to follow them shortly. But before he could escape, he was rounded up along with others by the Japanese army and interned in a prison camp. Writes one person who knew him in the Waisign internment camp, "Eric Liddell stood out among the 1,800 people packed into our camp, which measured only 150 by 200 yards. His gentle face and warm smile, even as he taught us games with the limited equipment available, showed us how much he loved children and missed his own. His was a selfless and humble spirit lived out before us. He gave special attention to the older people, the weak and the ill, and without the faithful and cheerful support of Eric, many of us simply would not have made it. In a camp that was rife with criticism and backbiting and gossip and covetousness, there was no one really who had a bad word to say about Eric. His attitude toward everyone was the same. You could find him talking to the businessman just the same as to the Roman Catholic priest or the child from Chefu, a school for missionary children. Unfortunately for Eric, death came just months before liberation. This same person goes on to say, "I remember seeing Eric just the day before he died. That day he was walking slowly under the trees As usual, he had a smile for everyone, but we knew nothing of the pain he was hiding or of the brain tumor that was to take his life the next evening, February 21st, 1945, this very day. But none of us will ever forget this man who was totally committed to his God, a man whose humble life combined muscular Christianity with radiant goodness. Mrs. Isabel Heron, who was one of the members of the camp, said of him, when Eric died, one of the women in the camp, a Russian prostitute, told my mother that Eric Liddell was the only man who had ever done anything for her and had not wanted to be repaid in kind. And it didn't matter what walk of life a person came from, Eric worked right across the board with everyone. He must have been, she says, very strong, because he really did treat us all the same. But which raises the question, where did such strength come from? Well, Eric brought to his personal life the same discipline that he had brought to the track during those years, long years of preparation for the Olympics. And those who were there remember most vividly the sight of him day after day, very early in the morning, off by himself in some corner of the camp, bent over his Bible, deep in reflection and in prayer to his God. Don't let the world around you squeeze you into its mold, but let God remold your minds so that you may prove in practice what is the will of God for you, what leads to the goal of true maturity, real life. A decision for a discipline. It's our call. Amen.